Hello everybody, I am the Indoor Adventurer. You are watching Simple and Keen, and today we are going to be returning to the sandbox, and we'll be discussing two different ways of creating a narrative. The first being the idea that your characters are the ones who are shaping the narrative itself, and the second being that you create your world based on having your players reach a specific plot point for your overarching story. In the time that I have been running games for my friends, I have often found myself fluctuating between these two story types, and I feel as though the sandbox is a perfect environment to experiment in as a DM. And while I do talk about tabletop gaming a decent bit on this channel, one of the things that I have always lost myself in was comics. And while comics didn't end up becoming my career by any means, I was always fascinated by the narrative structure that exists in comic books. I had been playing around with the idea of a superhero story in my head for a year or two when I ended up reading Super Gods by Grant Morrison, and it was after that I decided that I was also going to pursue my interests in earnest and started looking through the recommendation section of Morrison's book. It was there that I found two works that would be largely influential on how I view my own methods of storytelling, and I have used these methods in every game that I have ran. The first recommendation that I was given was Stan Lee's How to Write Comics. As perhaps one of the most renowned comic creators of all time, Stan Lee is responsible for the creation of characters like Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Iron Man, and Doctor Doom, as well as dozens of other Marvel staples, and the way that he described the essence of Marvel Comics was that you would start with the larger plot points and move backwards from there. For example, let's start with the idea of wanting to make Spider-Man fight an Allosaurus in the middle of Grand Central Station. What events would have to occur in order for this to become a reality within the series? You could have Kraven the Hunter somehow get his hands on dangerous technology capable of bringing dinosaurs back to life, and then he releases a museum's worth of dinosaurs into New York to give himself a chance to finally kill Spider-Man. Now, as soon as you put something that outlandish into the mix, that endpoint of Spider-Man in Grand Central seems like it would be the natural course of events given the context of what these characters want to actually do. This is obviously a much easier thing to do when you have all of the characters of the Marvel Universe, but it is still a really good way of tackling the time-old question of how do we get from point A to point B. When I am running games that I know are quick to devolve into chaos, I tend to lean more towards this style of writing because I feel like even if the players catch on that they're just happen to be a wizard's tower in the middle of an otherwise empty field, they know they're at least going to be in for an enjoyable time. And now that I had read Stan Lee's method of writing for Marvel Comics, I was curious to find out about the way that DC wrote for their comics as well, so I began going through Denny O'Neil's The DC Guide to Writing Comics, and what I found was actually a very interesting contrast. While Marvel writes their comics with the end goal already in mind, DC is much more organic in terms of figuring out their story. Rather than starting at the end point, O'Neil suggests that DC comics are more oriented around their characters and the motives of that character. In this way, we see comics such as the Green Lantern Green Arrow series, in which these two travel across the United States in a truck to learn about the problems that face everyday society. Even in comics with outlandish circumstances, DC does an excellent job of crafting their stories to reflect their characters' ideals. For example, we can see what happens when we take one of DC's finest heroes, Superman, and put him in a situation where he didn't land in Smallville, but rather in St. Petersburg during the Soviet Revolution. With his loyal nature to authority, Superman quickly becomes the ideal member of the USSR, donning a red and gray suit over his more traditional red and blue tights. Superman Red Sun is perhaps one of my favorite Superman stories because of this character study on the symbol of justice, for while the situation DC created was rather outlandish, Superman still acted upon his own code and set of morals. I have found from my experience DMing for my friends that the games that are more roleplay heavy follow the DC style of writing comics. If your players have discussed their backstories with you, you can start to get an idea of places and destinations your players may potentially want to visit, or world events that might involve them in some way. Your characters' backgrounds and personal stories can act as motivators during the adventure. For example, what if the party stumbles upon a group of woodsmen cutting down a tree ant in the woods, but they don't know it is a sentient creature until it starts attacking them? In this example, your party has an outlander who feels as though nature should be upheld at any costs, but another member in your ranks has family members who work in the timber industry. In this situation, you might find these two party members torn between who they will protect, the loggers or the tree creature, and will act according to their nature as characters based on the context of the situation. I feel like as a DM, being able to create a blend of the Marvel and DC method of storytelling can create an excellent narrative for your players that they will be able to enjoy regardless of the circumstance. To get an example of what I mean, we will actually be looking at Mike Mignola's Hellboy. Throughout the 20-some years that Hellboy has been around for, he has gone on dozens of adventures, some of which were long-running and others that were closer to a one-shot adventure. While some plot points are as simple as getting a young Hellboy to eat pancakes, there are also plot lines that span years of creative material, as several villains that you believed were just throwaway characters end up having almost as much depth as Hellboy himself. Every situation and every adventure was structured in such a way that Hellboy could simply be, as even the small moments were used as an opportunity to highlight aspects of Big Red. Mignola was always a huge inspiration for me when I was wanting to write my own comics, so it makes sense to me that I started incorporating his narrative style into my own stories. I was no longer just creating dungeons, towers, or evil wizards for the sake of adventure, but I was beginning to root things down in the worlds that I was crafting to help give them an air of realism. I knew that I couldn't force my players to roleplay if they didn't want to, but I could still learn to provide situations that allowed for them to display their ideals and bonds in a way that feels natural to them. Some of my favorite sessions are ones in which I found out more about my players and how they responded in social situations because of the way which these situations were handled. It becomes easy to forget the wizard's short temper, the barbarian's inability to dance, or the bard's difficulty when talking to women when you are in the throes of combat, so creating situations for your players to also just be is incredibly important. Without the roleplay elements of character creation and table presence, most of what you will be doing is throwing dice and waiting for whatever you are fighting to drop in combat. While there is certainly nothing wrong with this style of storytelling, as ultimately it is up to the group to decide how they want to play, I personally really enjoy the quiet moments between combat, as they often provide a much needed respite. Take the game series Monster Hunter, for example. In Monster Hunter, you go out on hunting quests to take down larger and larger monsters using your combat skills and prowess to your advantage when fighting against a variety of monsters and beasts. This game provides such a wonderful amount of stress in the fight to survive, and that is what makes the towns you visit all the more charming. While the world around you is dangerous and terrifying, the towns themselves are peaceful and full of quirky characters that you learn to appreciate during your hunts, as they are all mostly useful in some degree. When running games, I love to include these town moments for my players because I feel like it provides them with a chance to breathe and dig more into who they are as a character. Non-stressful situations can be a wonderful time to build up characters, as even having your players describe how an outsider of the group might see them can really impact the way your party members see that character. Shopping, crafting, or interacting with NPCs allows you to get a better understanding of how your character interacts with people they maybe aren't as comfortable around, and even that kind of interaction is a great way to learn more about that character. While I didn't ever become a writer for comics, the information I got on how to tell a compelling story from some of the greatest members of the industry was extremely significant in how I learned how to craft my own stories. In tabletop games, you can have the best of both Marvel and DC storytelling methods, as not only are you able to create situations for your characters to exhibit their ideals, but you also have options to tie those ideals into pieces of the world that will fuel any outlandish story event. In this way, I feel that rather than try and focus on the Marvel or DC way of writing, you want to be more like Mignola's Hellboy, in that you want to provide a series of circumstances that, no matter how small or large, always allows your characters to simply be themselves. Otherwise, how else are you going to find out that the cleric's favorite flavor confectionery is butterscotch, that the paladin you hired is secretly illiterate and can't read the sacred texts of the faith that they follow, or that the fighter in your group has already subscribed to this YouTube channel and even went as far to follow the links to the Simple and Keen Facebook and Twitter pages in the description. Without the help of everyone who has already subscribed to this channel, that fighter might never have found his way here, so I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has helped get the word out about this channel. All of the feedback that I have gotten so far has been really helpful as I continue figuring out the direction for this channel to go, so keep up, and remember, keep your wits sharp and your blades sharper.